Let us pray. Each day in this place, each one of us is expected to face the ongoing challenge of representing the concerns of all Albertans. May God grant us strength and wisdom to carry out these responsibilities. Amen.
Introduction of visitors. Presenting petitions. Reading and receiving petitions. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Notices of motions. Introduction of bills.
Mr. Speaker, I request leave to introduce Bill 56, Financial Administration Amendment Act. This is a money bill, Mr. Speaker. Her Honour, the Honourable the Lieutenant Governor, having been informed of the contents of this bill, recommends the same to the Assembly. Mr. Speaker, this piece of legislation is the heart of the financial administration of this government, setting in place all the controls, the way in which we operate in terms of investment and the management of the resources of this province. This legislation includes certain changes to allow us to deal with the contemporary instruments in the financial markets, such as swaps and hedges, and ensures we have specific opportunity to do just that. However, the main purpose of the bill, Mr. Speaker, is to increase the debt limits by $1 billion and to allow us to expand the total borrowing of the province to $6.5 billion. This is in line with the moves which we made last year with respect to the amendments to this legislation and is in accord with our long-term budgetary plan presented March 20th, 1987, which shows that the deficit this year and next year and through to 1990-91 will in fact require additional borrowings by this province.
The Honourable Provincial Treasurer has moved first reading of Bill 56, Financial Administration Amendment Act 1987. Do you agree? Opposed? So ordered.
Bill 56, being Financial Administration Amendment Act 1987, introduced by Honourable Mr. Johnston, is now read a first time.
Mr. Speaker, I request leave to introduce a bill being the Dairy Industry Amendment Act. Mr. Speaker, this bill provides for amendments which deal with pasteurization and the inspection of dairy premises formerly covered in the Public Health Act. It provides for a producer security fund and makes certain changes to the section dealing with imitation dairy products. Mr. Speaker, the bill also contains certain changes dealing with clarification of terminology.
The Honourable Member for Ponoka-Rimby has moved first reading of Bill 58, Dairy Industry Amendment Act 1987. Those willing to give consent to first reading, please say aye. Opposed, please say no. Carried.
Bill 58, being Dairy Industry Amendment Act 1987, introduced by Honourable Member Mr. Johnson, is now read a first time.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the bill be placed under the order paper under Government Bills and Orders for second reading.
On the motion of the Deputy Premier, those in favour, please say aye. Opposed, please say no. Carried.
Tabling returns and reports.
Minister of the Environment.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to table 4 reports with the Assembly today. First of all, the annual report 1984-1985 of Alberta Environment. Secondly, the annual report 1985-1986 of Alberta Environment. Thirdly, the annual review of the Alberta Environmental Centre 1985-86. And lastly, the annual report for the year 1986 of the Alberta Environmental Research Trust.
Minister of Labour.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to table with the Assembly the annual report for the Health Disciplines Board for the calendar year 1986.
Member for Grand Prairie, followed by the member for Edmonton Glengarry.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the annual report for the Northern Alberta Development Council for the year 1986-87 and file with the Assembly an ambulance service in our Northern Alberta report and the telecommunications in Northern Alberta report.
Representing Glengarry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to table for the Assembly response to a request for information made by the Minister of Agriculture on May 1st. It suggested changes to the registration of pesticides and a background paper explaining the need for those changes. I'd also like to file with the Legislature 3 copies of the research that went behind that, including documents from the Environmental Protection Agency and alternate legislation from California and Texas.
Edmonton Avonmore.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to file for the information of the members of this Assembly 3 copies of Breaking the Pattern, a publication of the Department of Social Services. I direct their attention to page 14.
Introduction of special guests.
Minister of Agriculture, followed by the Minister of Labour.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to introduce 2 individuals who are prominent in the agricultural community from the Lethbridge area. One is Mr. John Beckreen with High Pro Products Limited, and the other is Mr. Albert Genderin with Premier Grain. They're seated in the members' gallery, and I would ask them to rise to receive the warm welcome of the Assembly.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of my colleague, the member for Whitecourt, I'd like to introduce 12 students from the Piers School. They're accompanied by their principal, Mr. Brian O'Curley, a teacher, Miss Monica Taylor, 4 parents, Mrs. Diane Hopwood, who doubles up as a bus driver, Mrs. Laurie McGuire, Mrs. Sharon West, and Mrs. Susan Shantz. I'd like them to stand in the members' gallery and receive the usual welcome of the Assembly.
Red Deer South.
Mr. Speaker, it's a pleasure for me to introduce to you and through you to the members of the Legislative Assembly a good friend visiting this afternoon, Mrs. Linda Larry, and her parents who are visiting with her from Florida. I understand they're here to enjoy some of that good Alberta sunshine. Mr. and Mrs. King.
Member for Clover Bar.
I take great pleasure this afternoon in introducing 24 grade 6 students from the Rudolph Hennig School in Fort Saskatchewan. They are accompanied by their teachers, Mr. Jim Kuzik, Mrs. Alexandric, Mrs. DeMar, and their parents, Mrs. Tashik, Mrs. Boudreau, and Mrs. Slade. They are in the public gallery. I'd like them to rise and receive the recognition of the Assembly.
Ministerial statements. Oral question period.
With the indulgence of the member, could we perhaps gain unanimous consent of the House to revert to reading and receiving of petitions? Opposed? Member for Drumheller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move that the petition of Jimmy W. Chow for the Jimmy W. Chow Bar Admission Act be now read and received.
Does the Assembly agree with the motion moved by the Honourable Member for Drumheller? Opposed? Carried.
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Standing Order 93, I have taken under consideration the petition for the Jimmy W. Chow Bar Admission Act and have to report to the Assembly that Standing Order 86 has not been complied with. The Private Bills Committee has considered the matter of that petition and recommends to the Assembly that the provisions of Standing Order 86 be waived to permit the bill to be dealt with once the proper advertising has been completed. I request the concurrence of the Assembly in this recommendation.
Does the Assembly concur in the recommendation? Opposed? So ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the first question of the Minister responsible for advanced education. Not just since yesterday, but especially since yesterday, I've been contacted by many students of private vocational institutions. Their concerns, particularly with respect to the Computer Career Institute, are mainly that the curriculum that is given to the Department of Advanced Education look fine on paper but aren't actually delivered in the classroom. And they're paying, $5,000 a year for tuition. The minister admitted yesterday that there are problems at some private vocational institutes, and I wonder if the minister will now admit that, in fact, the lack of timely action from his department upon receiving complaints from students of such institutions has resulted in jeopardizing the credentials that these students now bear or their futures.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't know what more I can add to the responses I gave to the honourable member yesterday. We are investigating currently a number of complaints from students enrolled in accounting courses which are not recognized at the present time by the General Accountants Association of Alberta. I understand that some of the students have transferred to NAIT and are being accommodated there in an accelerated program, during which time one of the courses offered by the Career Institute is being recognized. But the point as to whether or not the students were misled at the time of their registration is one that we're having more difficulty determining.
Well, it wasn't quite the question, Mr. Speaker, but supplementary to the minister, I'm not sure if he's aware of this, but the Computer Career Institute pays a commission to salaried and commissioned employees to enroll students. That is, they're paid additional money to get higher student enrollment. Now, I wonder how the minister can justify the use of taxpayers' dollars to be used in that way when his own budget cuts funding to the recognized public vocational institutes of some significant merit.
Well, I'm not quite certain as to the thrust of the program, of the question, Mr. Speaker. The only public funds that are involved are equal in both cases, whether a student gets support from the Student Finance Board for attendance at a public school or at a private vocational school. The cap and the amount are equal. So the extent of public funds that is involved is the same in both cases. It's true that we are concerned about the amount of money in total going to support students enrolled in these high tuition courses at private schools because of the high failure rate. And that is where the concern comes in. Frankly, the method by which the private institutes pay their instructors, whether it's on a course or a number of students, is really not the affair of the government.
Well, supplementary question, Mr. Speaker. The minister has just identified the problem in a nutshell. The point is that these private institutions are encouraging people who might not be qualified to enroll just to get their money. My question to the minister is what steps is he going to take to make sure that the curriculum that they advertise and enroll students on is as good in delivery as it is on paper? What is he going to do?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think I dealt with that issue yesterday when I answered the questions. I'll go through them again. The financial problem, which the member has correctly identified, has been spoken about myself, and steps are being taken to allocate or put a cap on that because of the problem that's been identified. The question of advertising is dealt with on an ongoing basis, and recently all the private schools were circularized because of some improper advertisements that had appeared, and a stop has been put to those. The last issue, the recognition of accredited courses, is one which is an ongoing process and is underway at all times. The specific issue that the honourable member is dealing with through some of her constituents is whether or not students were misled at the time they enrolled in a course. And we're presently looking at that, but it's not going to be an easy question to answer.
Well, final supplementary question, Mr. Speaker. Recently, when I wrote to the minister, I received a response not just from the Advanced Education Minister, but also from the Career Development and Employment Minister, in which the latter noted, and I quote, "Some private vocational schools have used the department's involvement as a basis for their advertising, which is a contravention of their regulations." Just last Saturday, one of our researchers at the centre was encouraged to enroll if he had qualified, and quote, because, quote, "Alberta Manpower pays the entire shot. It's free." That was from an official at the Institute. Will the Minister of Career Development and Employment confirm that the CCI was one of those schools he referred to in his letter and now recognize that they're continuing to violate the very regulations that he identified?
Mr. Speaker, CCI was one of the schools that contravened our advertising regulations. It was not the one you're referring to. We were concerned about another instance of advertising.
Minister of Career Development and Employment, or not? Westlock Sturgeon, supplementary.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister of Advanced Education. It would seem that, once again, it's caveat emptor, or a license of this government, like in daycare, means a hunting license rather than... Could the Minister tell the House what procedures he has if he finds that any of these schools, when he finds these schools are not delivering what they promised, what systems he has for prosecuting and seeing that the money is returned and the license taken away?
Well, Mr. Speaker, there are two avenues which are open. In the cases of students who felt that they have been misled or didn't understand what it was they were buying, we usually are successful in arranging for the school and the students to get together and arrange on a refund of tuition fees on a prorated basis, because sometimes the students bring forward their concerns at a very late date after they've received, in fact, many hours of instruction. But in other cases, if a school is not performing the way it said it would, there are two avenues of protection for the public. The government, through our department, can withdraw the license of the school and put them out of business. And secondly, there are bonding requirements which protect the financial involvement of the students.
Clover Bar.
Mr. Speaker, supplementary question to the Deputy Premier. Is the Minister in a position to indicate if there's a review going on in the Minister's Department or the Minister of Career Development and Manpower to monitor courses where federal and provincial funds are involved through bursaries and tuition encouragement, to see if these funds are being expended properly and the courses are doing something for personal and career development?
Mr. Speaker, I tried yesterday also to deal with that larger problem. Traditionally, Alberta has had a number of very excellent private vocational schools which have offered courses not generally offered by the public institutions, and they fulfilled a very good role. They tended, up until very recently, to be involved in the beautician and hairdressing and personal grooming and lifestyle aspect on the one hand, and the other major category was in secretarial and office services. We've seen in the last 3 to 4 or 5 year period, because of the explosion in technology, a whole new family of these private schools grow up. And most of them are excellent. Some of them are very good, and I suspect that 1 or 2 of them are not very good. And it's a responsibility of our department to license them, bond them, and protect the students who buy services from them.
Second main question, Leader of the Opposition, acting.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to designate the second question to the member for Calgary Forest Lawn.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, due to this government's policies, we've lost our guaranteed crude market in central Canada. We've witnessed dramatic increases in the profits that oil companies are making from their downstream operations, all at great expense to the Alberta Treasury, Alberta producers. Now, Mr. Speaker, Albertans are paying more for gasoline at the pump than our residents in the City of Toronto. Can the minister explain why? Can he explain the evidence of this failure of his policies and now convince, is this evidence, pardon me, Mr. Speaker, will this evidence of failure of his policies now convince the minister to take action to ensure that Albertans receive a fair return from their resource?
The clap is for finally doing it right.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable member knows full well that as of June the 1st, we had a 5-cent litre tax on at the pump in Alberta, with the protection put in place for the consumers that farm fuel allowance that was have in place. Also, I think it's important to note that the honourable member is not accurate in saying that prices are higher in Alberta than they are elsewhere in the country. As of June the 3rd, Mr. Speaker, there's considerable variation in the price of gasoline at the pumps in Ontario and in the City of Toronto, ranging from approximately 42 to 45 cents per litre. And there's considerable volatility because the previous week in Toronto it was as high as 46 cents per litre. And in Calgary and Edmonton on June the 3rd, the price was 43.2 in Edmonton and 43.9 in Calgary. So the price of gasoline at the pumps in this province is comparable with the price of gasoline at the pumps in Ontario. And I think the honourable member should be aware of the fact that competitive forces actually are such that in Toronto, because of the size of the markets, you would actually expect to produce lower prices in most commodities, including gasoline. Also, there's the total volumes of gasoline sold are greater in large markets, and consequently the profit margin can be reduced. And another thing to take into account is the large number of retailers that are in existing, striving for a share of the market in Ontario. And finally, Mr. Speaker, the closeness of the United States is an important factor too, with the movement of petroleum products across the border. And with the larger number of refineries, there's greater competition. So, Mr. Speaker, when the honourable member says that gasoline prices at the pump here are higher than they are elsewhere in the country, that's simply not true. If you look at Saskatchewan, for example, they do not have a tax at the pump yet, but they also haven't had a provincial budget as yet. So, Mr. Speaker, we will continue to monitor prices. However, I think honourable members need to be aware that we have no intention to regulate pump prices and that the marketplace will determine those prices.
Well, even with that, how can the minister explain when the prices in Ontario are still 2 or 3 cents per litre higher, even when you take into account the effect of taxes and the fact that gasoline or the crude oil has to be transported to Ontario?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't believe the honourable member listened to all the reasons I gave a few minutes ago. My first response is an answer to the second question.
I think it was an answer because he certainly didn't take into account the cost of transporting crude from Alberta to Ontario in his answer. In that the minister helped initiate this present environment, will the minister now admit that the process of crude decontrol has served to exacerbate the negative impact on Alberta of the fall in world oil prices?
Doesn't have an answer.
Too tough. In Calgary Forest Lawn?
Too tough.
Well, how can the minister justify the fact that the federal government takes more money from the sale of gasoline in Alberta than Alberta receives, and in other Canadian provinces it takes twice as much as the government of Alberta receives?
Still the price is cheaper.
Well, Mr. Speaker, maybe you should direct that question to the federal government in terms of the amount of take at the pump. As a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, as a province, we are taking a smaller share than we did previously because of the reduction in our royalties in this province. In fact, during the month of May, on a litre of gasoline at the pump, a retail price of 38.2 cents, the provincial share of that was 4.1 cents, and the federal share was 10 cents. And that change on the part of the federal government was not great compared to what it had been in the past. It was relatively the same. If you compare our share with a year ago, it's considerably less. And the reasons that we are taking less than we did before, as I mentioned, is because of the lower royalties. But if the honourable member wants to represent or make representation to the federal government, he should do so.
Westlock Sturgeon, followed by Vermilion Viking and perhaps Clover Bar.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker, to the Premier, outside of the Minister of Energy reading a SO News release for the answer, he did say that there's more competition in Toronto, Mr. Premier. In view of that, and the vertical integration we have here in Alberta, where we don't even allow the breweries to own bars, will the Premier introduce legislation in this House that will separate the ownership of service stations from that of refineries so we can get some real competition in the marketplace rather than the charade that the Minister of Energy is condoning right now?
Mr. Speaker, most people in Alberta are familiar with the fact that the Honourable Liberal Party and the NDP Party would like to have greater government influence and control, greater government spending, bigger governments, taking away the freedom of individuals to make decisions, and we don't support that. We believe in free enterprise. We believe in individual freedoms and less regulation. Just because you folks are a group of socialists, we aren't.
Vermilion Viking.
To the Minister of Energy, supplemental, could you indicate the amount of gas and oil used in Ontario that originates offshore or outside of this country?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the point that to the question certainly is one of importance in terms of gasoline prices in the Toronto area in view of the fact that they are close to the U.S. markets, and also there is the ability to move some crude into that part of the country to compete with Western Canadian crude. But the biggest factor in my mind is the closeness to the U.S. market and the larger number of refineries in the area, and the fact that there's many more retailers in the area.
Westlock Sturgeon, Leader of the Liberal Party.
Mr. Speaker, this question, my question now is to the Provincial Treasurer. Mr. Speaker, we have evidence again of how this government has mismanaged finances and with the deplorable state of the pension fund. Poor planning, irresponsible management, faulty legislation has resulted in a catastrophe for the growing number of pensioners that have devoted their services to this government. The first question, Mr. Speaker, yeah, you better worry, because there might not be anything left for you there. There is a provision in the Pension Fund Act for the transfer of monies from general revenue to cover any deficit in the pension fund. Will the Treasurer admit that the government had never intended to set aside a pool of monies for the pension fund because it could always fall back on general revenues?
Bucks in there. Mr. Speaker, there's no question that, as I've said before in this Assembly, that the government has a fairly major concern about the size of the unfunded pension liability. But that was accumulated over not just 1 year or 2 years, but accumulated over the life of the pension plans themselves. And what has happened, Mr. Speaker, is that, of course, we have found that it's far too easy to provide additional benefits under the plan, and to some extent, governments generally are far too hesitant to increase the contributions by the beneficiaries. That doesn't mean, Mr. Speaker, that what the member from Westlock Sturgeon has suggested, that there's any problem or any failure, potential for failure in this fund, that those people who are now drawing the pension benefits will continue to draw them, and those people who will anticipate pension benefits will get them. And I think it's important that the kind of fear that is being publicized here by both the member from Meadowlark and the member from Westlock Sturgeon should be corrected. The obligations under all the pension plans administered by this government will in fact continue. Now, with respect to the policy, I did have an opportunity in the last 2 or 3 days to speak briefly about the policy questions. I've indicated both the concern and both the determination to deal with the problem. As I've said before, Mr. Speaker, this government, during the period of high oil royalties, did in fact transfer to those pension funds $1 billion. $1 billion, Mr. Speaker. And that was to deal with, in part, the unfunded liability. More recently, Mr. Speaker, my colleague, the Minister of Education, as a matter of fact, I believe this past Thursday morning, passed an order in Council which in fact dealt with some of the problems with respect to the unfunded liability there by increasing the contributions by teachers to their own fund, which is administered by the province. So, Mr. Speaker, the policy question is open. As I've said before, I haven't seen many positive recommendations flowing from this Liberal Socialist Party across the way, but I do hope that instead of being critical and denying the importance of the pension funds, the long-term assistance which we're providing to the pensioners under these plans, that they had come forward with some positive recommendations.
Mr. Speaker, to the Treasurer, it's interesting he's now thrown himself on the mercy of the opposition and asked us to keep quiet and not tell anybody of the screw-up. Would the Treasurer going to go this far? He's already admitted he transferred $1 billion to the pension fund in good times. Will he admit that we're over $500 million behind now? We have a $542 million deficit in the pension fund right now.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I would direct the members' attention to the annual statements because, in fact, the unfunded liability is far higher than that. Let me say that we are not misleading at all, Mr. Speaker. In fact, we're very candid about the problem we're facing. And contrary to what the member from Westlock Sturgeon would suggest, we're dealing with the problem. We're looking at remedies. We have a working paper which my colleague from Norwood attempted to file in the legislature yesterday. And that policy paper, in fact, makes some very significant recommendations, which we'll be pursuing, as I indicated, with my colleagues in government. But let it never be said, Mr. Speaker, that we're fearful that this government will not meet the challenge in dealing with the problem, will not provide alternatives to those boards, and will not meet the commitment to the future generations who will see benefits. That, in fact, is our commitment, Mr. Speaker. It should be made very clear, because it is, in fact, this kind of negative reaction from the Liberals across the way that strikes fear in the beneficiaries under the pension plan. And that really, Mr. Speaker, is misrepresenting, in fact, what is happening with respect to the plans themselves.
Mr. Speaker, this government is very able at storing money aside for travel funds, lottery funds, and everything else, but not for the pensioners. Would the Treasurer assure the Assembly that when he gets around to replenishing this fund, making it operate like a real pension fund should, that he will not do it on the back of the government employees and past government employees?
There you are, Mr. Speaker. You see, without really understanding the dimensions of the problem, he is short-sightedly taken one aspect of the problem and tried to take some political credit for that particular aspect of it. Mr. Speaker, there are a variety of solutions which we could put forward. One of them, in fact, is to end the existing pension plans and start a new one, but ensuring fully that everyone covered by the existing plans, those obligations are continued. We know, as I said before, we could make the plan fully funded tomorrow. There are a variety of possibilities that are open to us. We want to get the most equitable settlement, Mr. Speaker. We're not going to move in a quick and unreasoning position. We're going to have full consultation. We're going to carefully consider the options before us, and we are committed to make it work. Now, the facile kinds of solutions that are given to us by the Liberal Party, including the often quoted use of lottery funds, is just irrelevant, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I have had a letter from no less a personage than Anders Elberg, a former treasurer, who used to manage this, I think, wise, voicing disapproval and concern about the ex-government employees' pensions. So there's a very valid worry. Will the Treasurer then assure this Assembly that he will enact a legislation to establish a pension fund which is separate from general revenue and is self-supporting and making money? Will he separate now? Will he give that promise to the House that he will go ahead and separate the two and put a decent pension fund into place?
The Chair must address a question to the member for Westlock Sturgeon as to whether or not the member cleared with that person is mentioned as to whether the name and correspondence could be mentioned in the House.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I will be glad to table it. I believe other members have had copies. I thought maybe even you had received one because it went out to all the MLAs. And it was a very succinct damning of the present Treasurer's system.
Mr. Speaker, I will not say anything but to commend the correspondence that many of us get from the former provincial treasurer of this province, who did manage the resources of the province very well during the period of up to 1971, I would assume. But what that letter does say, Mr. Speaker, is points to one very significant element, and that is, by way of public policy, how does the government deal with the question of COLA clauses and whether or not those COLA clauses and pensions should be built in as a matter of contract. Because, of course, what has happened is the funding arrangements for the plans themselves do not reflect any COLA clauses, and therefore the contributions by the employees are not based in any expectation of increase by inflation or by some kind of cost of living adjustment. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, this government has continued since 1971 to increase the COLA, or to increase the adjustments in the payments of those pensioners receiving benefits under the plan, in some years twice, as a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, during periods of high inflation. But it is that very fact, Mr. Speaker, that causes the pension funds to be underfunded, because the contributions do not reflect or do not have a specific policy that would suggest that COLA should be built in. From my point of view, Mr. Speaker, there is a great deal of peril in building in a COLA clause in these pension funds, because the contribution levels would be almost unbearable. And that's essentially what's happened, Mr. Speaker. As I've indicated, there are a variety of solutions. I could go on to talk about them, Mr. Speaker. I could give you 5 or 6 solutions, but I think that I'd be coming close to debating a resolution as opposed to dealing with the question period. I simply close by saying we know that we can find a resolution of this problem, Mr. Speaker. We have the opportunity internally within our government to find the solutions, and we're determined to do just that, Mr. Speaker.
Clover Bar, followed by Stony Plain, followed by Edmonton Highlands.
Mr. Speaker, the provincial treasurer, I'm not quite as worried about the provincial funding as I am about the federal. Can the minister indicate what comparison the minister has to indicate how our funding compares to the federal pension funds?
As a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, the Alberta's underfunded liability is really not as dramatically underfunded as, in fact, the centralist government under the administration of the Liberal Party, which was very prolific in its spending, obviously led that government down the road of unremitted debt. It's impossible, both in terms of the deficit of that government, the Liberal government history, and the history of the pension plans themselves, that in fact it's impossible to reverse it in the federal government's sense. We have a chance to deal with it here, Mr. Speaker. I sense from all party resolution that there's a determination to do just that, and we'll be making recommendations to deal with that problem, Mr. Speaker.
Stony Plain, Edmonton Highlands.
Supplementary question to the provincial treasurer, Mr. Speaker. Would the provincial treasurer please confirm that the unfunded liability is a very complex assumption based on projected interest rates, inflation rates, and the world of tomorrow, and that to hang the myth that we do not have the money today is perhaps a bit incorrect at this point in time?
Mr. Speaker, let me indicate, Mr. Speaker, that even through a question period here today, whether we like it or not, we've essentially outlined a fundamental set of policy questions that have to be dealt with. We've talked about the COLA clause, we talked about the contributions, we talked about the opportunity for additional government contributions to the plan, and now with an understanding of the future, my colleague from Stony Plain has indicated one of the other problems that is implicit in the plans, and that is that the actuarial calculations, given the new changes in the longevity of individuals, has in fact protracted the payoff beyond, in fact, what we've expected. And therefore, because people are living longer, and because the benefits are extended longer, Mr. Speaker, obviously there is an additional problem for the funds themselves. As the new actuarial tables are completed, as the new age pyramids are reflected in the payoff matrix, in fact, you'll find that the contribution will have to be increased as well. So, Mr. Speaker, you can see that this is not a simple question. This is not one which is a simple one-variable solution. It's one, as we've seen in this discussion here already, that requires a number of alternatives. They've been expressed, they've been addressed. I would welcome an opportunity from any one of those parties across the way to provide us with a resolution of the problem, the recommendations in particular, so we can weigh and sense what, in fact, they have to recommend to us.
Mr. Speaker, to the minister who talks so glibly about removing the COLA clauses, for which future pensioners are already contributing and would thereby be impoverished, will the minister now agree to table the document, the table of contents of which were revealed here a few days ago in the Assembly by the official opposition leader, to allay the fears of people who might be involved and so that they can have their input to the minister?
Mr. Speaker, you see a little bit of information. They get, they're the only hope that there's another brown envelope around the corner. I mean, that's how they do the research, Mr. Speaker. They would love to have an envelope a day. You know, that'd be a theme song for them because, of course, it's the only effective research and only effective policy positions are the leaked memos that come from the government side.
Member for Little Bow, followed by Edmonton Glengarry.
Mr. Speaker, my question is not with regards to my pension. It's with regards to the potential revenue of the province of Alberta and the future gas price in Alberta, natural gas price, as it may be affected by the actions of Manitoba in terms of their purchase of the intercity gas. Has the minister had a current review of that situation, and is there a strategy in place to react to Manitoba in a positive way?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we are assessing the actions that the Manitoba government has taken in the last few days with respect to being involved in the marketplace. As honourable members know, the agreement of natural gas pricing envisaged a more flexible and market-oriented pricing regime for natural gas within this country. And really what was contemplated was a regime where we had fairness for both the consumers and the producers in this country. And in fact, the specific clause in the agreement between the three western provinces and the federal government was such that there was to be respect for existing contracts with distributors, with their price renegotiations, and that those renegotiations would take place before November 1st, 1986. And that particular agreement stated that where contract renegotiation between buyers and sellers, whether of price or volume, takes place in good faith and on a voluntary basis, government will not obstruct the resulting commercial transaction. And therefore, the government of Manitoba is clearly acting to obstruct the renegotiated pricing arrangement between two bodies who are negotiating those contracts. So as far as we are concerned in this province, Mr. Speaker, we are striving for fairness and equity between both consumers and producers. We will be assessing the situation in Manitoba and then decide on how we would be dealing with the matter.
Mr. Speaker, supplementary to the minister, in early 1930s, Alberta was given the right of ownership of the natural resource, oil and gas. As one part of the minister's strategy or the government's strategy, is the government willing to implement that right of ownership and withhold the product under conditions where we lose our position in the marketplace?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I say, we are reviewing the situation in Manitoba, looking at the different options that are available. Certainly, as owners of the resource constitutionally, they are our resources. However, we do not contemplate cutting anybody off from gas supply in this country, and I don't think that anybody is expecting that. Manitoba government has taken this particular action, obviously, to try to get lower prices for natural gas. As I said, we will assess the situation and then decide how to handle the matter.
Mr. Speaker, supplementary to the minister hasn't been clear in terms of what options are available to Alberta under these circumstances. Could the minister be more explicit as to what specific steps can be taken to protect our right of ownership?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't think it would serve any useful purpose at this time to review all those options publicly. We are reviewing them right now, and once we've reviewed all those options, we'll decide on how to handle the matter.
Mr. Speaker, supplementary to the minister, is the minister contemplating any type format of meetings, such as the energy ministers of Canada coming together and agreeing on some type of a Canadian policy relative to this matter?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as part of the discussions we had last October with the federal minister, it was agreed at that time that the signatories to the natural gas pricing agreement would get together at the date around the end of June 1987, and it's our intention to follow up on that. In addition, Mr. Speaker, it's important to add that I have had a number of meetings with the Minister of Energy in Manitoba, and certainly plan on meeting with him again.
Supplementary, Calgary Buffalo.
Thank you. I'd just like to the minister, I'd like the minister to know that I support efforts to keep the prices up, although I'm appalled at the mess that the fumbling government has gotten us into. What I would ask the minister is, how can the minister challenge the right of Manitoba to refer the validity of the supply contracts to the courts, since Manitoba is clearly entitled to challenge under the deregulation process that you set in motion?
Legal opinion, and that can't be answered, Honourable Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we believe that in the process, the ultimate objective of deregulation, and we feel that we can achieve that objective by having ongoing discussions with other provinces in this country. Certainly, the steps taken by Manitoba to nationalize their gas distributor company, and also to introduce legislation which sets in place a ceiling price for natural gas, is obviously not in line with the original deregulation objectives. However, Mr. Speaker, we will be having meetings, as I indicated, and trying to remove these barriers so that we can proceed to the ultimate objective of natural gas deregulation.
Here, Calgary Forest Lawn Supplementary.
To the Minister of Energy. How does the Minister of Energy justify the fact that gas is currently being sold to U.S. utilities at $1.80 an MCF, at least for the gas portion, and Ontario residents are paying $1 more than that, Manitoba residents are paying $1.20 more than that, and Albertans are paying 80 cents more than that for their consumer gas?
Well, Mr. Speaker, that's a gross misrepresentation of the facts. Mr. Speaker, the facts are that the average price for Alberta gas going into the United States is higher than the average price for natural gas going into domestic markets outside of Alberta. There obviously is a larger, there's a difference between the price of natural gas in the industrial markets and than there is into the so-called core markets, where the security of supply, longer-term contracts are in place. So when we're comparing prices, we have to be careful on the basis of which we compare them.
Calgary McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The NDP complains we don't get enough money for our natural resources. Now their colleagues in Socialist Manitoba want to rob us of their support. Will the minister ensure that he will not allow the Socialist government of Manitoba to hold the free-thinking, industrialist, hard-working people of Alberta up to ransom for a reasonable price for a resource owned by Albertans?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I start out by saying that we want to have fairness and equity in terms of dealing with the consumers and the producers in this country, and we'll try to work with Manitoba to achieve that.
Edmonton Glengarry, followed by Edmonton Avonmore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For the Minister of the Environment, I have been told that the Swan Hills Hazardous Waste Treatment Plant will be monitored for pollution-causing emissions by Western Research, which is owned entirely by Bow Valley Resource Services. In terms of serving the safety needs of the environment, this sounds a lot like putting a bank robber in charge of bank security. Is the minister not concerned that at worst this puts Bow Valley in a very serious conflict of interest, and at best will create the public appearance of that conflict of interest?
Mr. Speaker, when the Alberta Special Waste Management Corporation selects its consultants, it sets out to obtain the best possible quality and expertise. In this case, Western Research is considered one of those. Several years ago, Mr. Speaker, when the decision was made to gather baseline data with respect to the Alberta Special Waste Management Corporation, proposals went out to a variety of consulting firms in the province of Alberta. A proposal went out to 3 companies. One of those companies was not Western Research. Proposals were asked from these companies to provide the data and the criteria that would be used in providing the baseline data. After looking at the proposals that came from the 3 companies in question, the 3 basically were viewed to not have had the expertise required for the particular study. The Board of Directors then directed that a contract should go to Western Research, and I should point out, Mr. Speaker, that Western Research was hired by the Board of Directors of Alberta Special Waste Management Corporation, and furthermore, that the work in question was subcontracted to the University of Calgary.
He quite missed the point of the question in that I was speaking of future monitoring to be done once they open. This company also helped establish test protocols for the opening phase of the plant this summer. Why is it that the protocols were set only by those who with a commercial interest in the venture without input from qualified interest groups or members of the public?
Well, Mr. Speaker, that simply isn't the case at all. There's certainly been more than one consultant, Western Research, which has subcontracted the work, in part to the University of Calgary. One of the other directives that has also been provided to the Alberta Special Waste Management Corporation, that a mechanism should be set up whereby the town of Swan Hills, the duly elected council of the town of Swan Hills, should be in a position to hire consultants, independent consultants on their own, to test all of the baseline data that has been gathered since 1983 with respect to 4 or 5 different components dealing with the air, the water, wildlife, soil, with respect to the area around Swan Hills. The town of Swan Hills will be in a position to hire their own independent consultants to check on all of the consultants that have been hired by the Alberta Special Waste Management Corporation, and the government will provide to the town of Swan Hills the dollars to pay for those consultants. We will not be involved. The town will hire their own independent consultants to judge, and there's one other third mechanism of balance we've also put in place, and that is that the Department of the Environment will also check as well. So there will be 3 checks. In addition to that, Mr. Speaker, all baseline information has been made available to the public. Any person in the province of Alberta who would wish to go down to the Alberta Special Waste Management Corporation offices that are located at the corner of 109th Street in Jasper and downtown Edmonton, the corporation there would be very happy to provide any individual in the province of Alberta the baseline information gathered to date, and any individual can check it. So, in fact, there are 4 mechanisms, separately and independently, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that the environment in the area close to Swan Hills, in the environment in the constituency of Barrhead, which I live with my children, will in fact be totally protected, Mr. Speaker.
When I contacted the corporation, all I got were summaries written by your executive assistant, Mr. Thackeray. I'll go tomorrow to get the rest now that I have your assurance on that, and I appreciate it. I would like to ask the minister to confirm, though, that Western Research will be entirely in charge of the future stack monitoring and monitoring of air quality around the plant when it opens up.
Mr. Speaker, it's considered inappropriate to use a certain word in the Assembly. I've used that word before, Mr. Speaker, and I've been ruled out of order, and I've had to stand up on a point of order. But what the member from Edmonton Glengarry just has said, Mr. Speaker, is totally incorrect with respect to any report written by my executive assistant. It is, well, Mr. Speaker, there's a stronger word than incorrect. The word is liar. The word is gross, something that the Minister of Energy had to use a few minutes ago in response to a question raised by somebody from the NDP party. But to suggest that summary reports with respect to baseline data that have been supplied by a Crown Corporation of the province of Alberta, run by an independent board of directors, the Alberta Special Waste Management Corporation, that data, that summary report was written by my executive assistant, is absolutely, totally, 100% wrong, Mr. Speaker, and that must be withdrawn in order to protect the integrity of a very innocent individual.
I'm not finished. It's
With respect, an examination of the blues will take place and some discussion between the member for Edmonton Glengarry and the Minister of the Environment. Time for question period has expired. Might we have unanimous consent to complete this series of questions and also for the Minister of Social Services to give some information in reply to a question as raised in the last few days by Edmonton Avonmore? Opposed? Member for Edmonton Glengarry.
Thank you. I've always felt that to call a questioner a liar is the last resort of one without answers.
Honourable member, the question.
In view of all of this, how can the minister expect the public to believe that the purpose is not to hide any pollution that might occur and make it impossible to prove it if the truth leaks out?
Mr. Speaker, let me reiterate. Since 1983, we have indicated as a government, I have indicated before I was a member of Executive Council, that the most important objective behind the Alberta Special Waste Management Corporation was safety, public safety. For one of the first times in the history of our province, we have set in place a process whereby baseline data, that is data, would be established, would be collected, would be evaluated, and would be made available to the public before a plant, in fact, has come on stream. Since 1983, studies by independent consultants has been underway. In addition to that, we are making available to the town of Swan Hills a duly elected independent municipal government funds to hire their own consultants without any direction from the government as to who they have to hire. The government will provide them the funds to pay for those consultants to check the information that has been assembled by the Alberta Special Waste Management Corporation. In addition to that, Mr. Speaker, Alberta Environment will function as an independent analysis of all of the baseline data gathered. In addition to that, Mr. Speaker, this baseline data is being made available to any citizen in the province of Alberta who chooses to go and get it at the Alberta Special Waste Management Corporation. That is all being put in place. In addition to that, Mr. Speaker, I want to assure the honourable member that no way has an executive assistant in my employ by the name of Thackeray been involved in writing any of the information. None involved, period. Mr. Speaker, the only unsettling aspect of this is the falsehoods and the allegations that are absolutely nonsensical coming from the New Democratic Party.
Are there additional supplementaries on this issue? Westlock Sturgeon.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, thank you. I'd like to direct the supplementary to the Speaker, as you can clear, or to the Premier. I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker. As you can see, this is another in a long line of boondoggles by the Minister of Environment and his department. Consequently, Mr. Premier, in view of the fact that this is a very serious question, hazardous waste and its disposal, it's the first of its type in the province. Many people are going to be worried. Would the Premier agree to have a Cabinet Committee review this latest decision to see that indeed there's no conflict of interest and indeed that the public are protected and appear to be protected as well as being in fact?
Mr. Speaker, obviously the honourable member has just slept through a question and answer period.
Minister of Social Services, Minister of Social Services, and then Edmonton Avonmore for.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday I have noted that in answered a series of questions initiated by the honourable member for Avonmore spoke to a number of things with respect to funding for women's shelters. And I wanted to enlarge on the information provided at that time. First of all, to say that the funding ending in the year, the fiscal year ended at March 31st, 1987, had been increased by $1.1 million. And the funding for this fiscal year remains the same as it was previously. There has been absolutely no cut in funding. The Council of Women's Shelters, Mr. Speaker, has worked very hard. I think that they are probably one of the hardest working groups in this country because they have also traveled other places and gleaning information. The President has told me about a number of those meetings, and they have evolved a model by which they thought a fair share of funding could be, or the funding could be fairly shared amongst the shelters in the province. Mr. Speaker, if there is any question at all with respect to the formula they have developed and that the minister has then subsequently followed, I know that the Council on Women's Shelters would be most pleased to review it. And as a matter of fact, the President has asked me for some assistance, which I have recommended flow to the organization to assess the model and to do a human resources inventory in order to speak to some of the questions that apparently have been raised by one of the other organizations.
Mr. Speaker, to the Minister, in view of the fact that 2,300 women were turned away from Calgary shelters last year, how can she say that the funding is adequate?
Mr. Speaker, the funding for social programs in many people's minds is never adequate. The funding flows through eventually and finally through the provincial treasurer of this province into all of the programs. The money isn't printed in a magic place in the basement of this legislature. It comes from the taxpayers. Taxpayers who, Mr. Speaker, I might add, care very much, if the honourable member would listen, care very much about the social programs in this province, and have indicated that by the kind of support that they have given for the enhanced budget that we have in so many areas this year. Mr. Speaker, if the honourable member representing the NDP in this province wishes us to follow the funding model and the dollars that flow in Manitoba, I just might remind the honourable member, Alberta stands third highest in Canada with respect to funding per 10,000 population at $15,677. Mr. Speaker, Manitoba, our great, wonderful image that we have portrayed for us here, has $9,335.
Okay.
Time for question period has expired. Point of order, Deputy Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's with some reluctance that I rise to bring to the attention of members on all sides of the House what I consider a very serious point of order, which reflects directly upon your office. We listened carefully to the exchanges in the question period yesterday, and I wanted to confirm them by looking at the final printed issue of Hansard for yesterday, and I'm now looking at page 1790, an exchange between yourself, Mr. Speaker, and the leader of the Liberal Party. During that interchange, the honourable member from Westlock Sturgeon, Mr. Taylor, said, speaking to you, yes, definitely, I think you're completely out of order. Mr. Speaker, I know that honourable members on all sides of the House are aware of the traditions of any House operating within the British parliamentary system, and the fact that you have attained your office with support from members from all sides of the House is important. Your office is our referee and our rule keeper. And with that goes a great deal of respect and tradition. The matter of respect and tradition notwithstanding, there are several citations to which I would like to refer dealing with the matter. The first one is citation number 11 from Beauchesne dealing with Speaker's rulings, which says the interpretation of both the written rules and tradition is in the hands of the Speaker and his deputies, with their rulings forming a fundamental part of procedure. Beauchesne citation number 52, referring to reflections on the Speaker, says to the members of the Assembly that the Speaker should be protected against reflections on his actions. Further on in Beauchesne, in citation 117, dealing with your office as a presiding officer in the House, and I quote, because it's a long citation, "When he rises to preserve order or to give a ruling, he must always be heard in silence. No member may rise when the Speaker is standing. Reflections upon the character or actions of the Speaker may be punished as breaches of privilege. His actions cannot be criticized incidentally in debate or upon any form of proceeding except by way of a substantive motion." The two citations following, 118 and 119, also deal with the behavior of the honourable member. Section 118 says the Speaker should be addressed as Mr. Speaker or Sir or Your Honour, not you. Citation 119 says Speaker's rulings, once given, belong to the House, which under Standing Order 12 must accept them without appeal or debate. Those are from Beauchesne. There are further citations, Mr. Speaker, from Erskine May, the 20th edition, page 234, section 2, says, "When he rises to preserve order or give a ruling on a doubtful point, he must always be heard in silence, and no member may stand when the Speaker is on his feet. Reflections upon the character or actions of the Speaker may be punished as breaches of privilege. His action cannot be criticized incidentally in debate or in any form of proceeding except by way of a substantive motion." No doubt there are other citations which one could find if one went into a lengthy search, Mr. Speaker, but in view of the seriousness of that, I'm standing now and giving the Honourable Leader a suggestion and also the opportunity that those remarks directed at you in yesterday's proceedings should be withdrawn.
Speaker, if I may comment on it, I will first want to thank the Honourable Associate Premier for informing me that he would be bringing up the issue. And I want to say, Mr. Speaker, that I have a great deal of respect for the traditions of this House and a great deal of respect for your position. And if I've transgressed, and I think clearly after reading answered, I was certainly out of order in saying that you were out of order. And in fact, in the heat of the argument, I suppose I was carried away. So consequently, Mr. Speaker, I apologize not only to you, but to the whole House for taking against your position.
The Chair wishes to express its thanks to the Deputy Premier for raising the matter and dealing with it in such a workmanlike manner, and also indeed expresses thanks for the graciousness at which the member for West Loch Sturgeon made the apology. Might we, orders of the day, might we revert briefly to the introduction of special guests? Member for Little Bow,